There is a story the Church never tells. Beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, 9 knights dug in silence, no witnesses, no records, no permission. When they emerged years later, they were rich beyond reason and powerful beyond logic. Some say they found gold. Others whisper of ancient scrolls. But the few who aren't supposed to speak, they suggest something far more dangerous. A lineage, a bloodline, one that could shake the very foundations of Christian history, if ever confirmed. Because if Jesus had descendants and the Templars found them, then everything changes. So let's step quietly now. Not into legend or fantasy, but into the fragile corridors of history, where faded scrolls, carved stones, and forgotten ruins might hold answers. This isn't just a story about knights, it's a story about legacy, and what happens when those sworn to protect it vanish. The Knights Templar were not born in myth, but they certainly died in it. Officially formed in 1119 to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, these warrior monks rapidly evolved into one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe. But beneath the armor and piety, a stranger thread runs, one that leads back to the earliest days of Christianity, and perhaps even further. Their headquarters stood atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Their symbols hinted at secrets buried below. And for centuries rumors swirled that their true mission was never about guarding roads, but about guarding blood. Sacred blood. Blood that may have passed from Christ himself. Tonight we explore that possibility, step by step, fact by fragile fact. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You can almost feel the heat rising off the stone even now. The year is 1119, and Jerusalem is no longer a battlefield, but it is far from peaceful. Just 2 decades after the First Crusade carved a Christian kingdom out of the Levant, the Holy City is still riddled with tension. Pilgrims arrive in droves seeking salvation or penance. But outside the walls, bandits and remnants of resistance wait with swords drawn. In this fragile equilibrium, 9 men arrive not in shining armor, but with a purpose cloaked in mystery. They are knights, yes, but not like the others. They call themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It's a bit of a mouthful even for the Middle Ages, so the world quickly shortens it to something simpler, the Knights Templar. Officially, their mission is humble. They intend to protect pilgrims making the treacherous journey to Jerusalem. But here's the curious part: for the first 9 years, these knights take no new recruits. They fight no major battles. They live in near secrecy. And most strangely, they reside in a set of quarters given to them by King Baldwin II. Rooms built atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temple, known then as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You may wonder why there, of all the places in the city, why station a new order of knights on top of one of the holiest and most symbolically fraught pieces of land in the world. The traditional answer is political convenience. The king had no better place. But there's another version. One that has been whispered, debated, and dismissed for centuries. According to this version, the Templars were not merely guarding pilgrims. They were sent to retrieve something, or perhaps someone. Historical records from this period are sparse, but what survives tells us that the founding members were not just soldiers. Many came from families tied to esoteric Christian traditions, nobility with ties to old Merovingian legends, strange interpretations of the gospel, and a near obsession with relics. Hugues de Payens, the first Grand Master, had extensive connections in France and the Holy Land, and some believe he had prior dealings with certain Eastern Christian sects groups who viewed Jesus not as a distant divinity, but as a man who walked married and fathered children. That alone would get you excommunicated in most circles. Still, it's worth asking why 9 knights with no known funding, no clear battle record, and no real political backing were immediately given prime real estate over the Temple Mount, and why they were then left alone to do whatever it was they did. Modern historians sometimes roll their eyes at this part. The idea of the Templars as early archaeologists or clandestine treasure hunters feels romantic at best, conspiratorial at worst. But there's one documented fact that makes even the skeptics pause. In 1129, just 10 years after their formation, the Council of Troyes grants the Templars official sanction. Not just that, but they're suddenly flush with resources, land, and papal privileges that rival those of kings. Their rise is dizzying and oddly timed. What could they have uncovered in that first decade to earn such swift elevation? One obscure chronicle from the 12th century claims the knights found objects of great import beneath the sacred mount. It doesn't say what, but a later document attributed to the mysterious Order of Sion mentions scrolls written in Aramaic that described the lineage of the Nazarene king. That phrase alone has fueled centuries of speculation. Was it a reference to Jesus, or someone descended from him? Of course, the Vatican has long dismissed these tales as heretical folklore, and yet, it never seems to destroy the documents entirely. Instead, they disappear into archives, into vaults. You're left with fragments, letters that hint at discoveries in hollow places, carvings that bear symbols predating Christianity, yet found within Templar churches, and a strange consistency in Templar architecture, especially the recurring motif of 2 men riding a single horse. Unity, brotherhood, or perhaps duality, 2 natures in one being, one holy and one mortal. It's subtle, almost poetic, and also potentially blasphemous depending on how you read it. Scholars still argue over whether the Templars' original mission had any esoteric undertones. Some say it was pure coincidence. Others believe the original 9 knights were part of an elite lineage themselves, descendants of families who had preserved secret gospels since the days of Rome, quietly waiting for the chance to return to the source, to find proof. If so, the road to Jerusalem was not a military campaign. It was a pilgrimage of blood, a quest not for gold or glory, but for confirmation, for knowledge hidden beneath centuries of conquest and rubble, for the truth that may have survived in the dust of the temple. And if they did find something, anything, how long could they keep it secret? You can imagine them descending in silence, torches flickering against ancient stone. Beneath the Temple Mount, the air would have been heavy, centuries-old dust clinging to breath and cloth. By day, the Templars kept their vigil, but by night, or at least, so the rumors suggest, they dug. Not aimlessly, but with purpose, as if following a map or a memory, something whispered across generations. Official accounts of the Templars' early years say very little, and yet a cluster of later chronicles, particularly those penned in the 13th and 14th centuries, begin to repeat an odd refrain that the knights had conducted secret excavations beneath Al-Aqsa. The claim is often framed in cautionary language, allegations, speculations, charges, but it appears too frequently to dismiss entirely. They weren't just guests of the king. They were excavators of a forgotten past. One undeniable historical fact is that the Templars made the Temple Mount their headquarters for nearly 70 years. During that time, no other military or religious order was granted comparable access to this sacred and volatile site. And during their tenure, reports emerge faint, fragmentary, that strange relics began to surface. None were catalogued in church archives, none displayed in reliquaries. They simply vanished, or were never publicly acknowledged in the first place. The most tantalizing clue comes from a 19th century rediscovery. In the 1860s, British explorer and engineer Charles Warren conducted a series of deep surveys beneath the Temple Mount. His findings remain some of the most extensive ever recorded: narrow shafts, blocked staircases, hidden chambers. Among them was a long vertical tunnel, now called Warren's Shaft, that plunged deep beneath the surface. When his team descended, they found remnants of ancient construction, some clearly predating the Crusader period. But more intriguingly, they noted signs of previous disturbance: cut marks, dislodged stones, the sort of evidence left behind not by nature but by deliberate human hands. It wasn't hard to draw the conclusion someone had been there before them, perhaps centuries before, perhaps Templars. Now here's where things get strange. Among the theories that swirl around the Temple Mount excavations, one of the most persistent involves the Ark of the Covenant. Yes, the same Ark, golden sacred, lost to history. A favorite of adventurers and Hollywood archaeologists alike. Mainstream historians roll their eyes, of course. But the theory didn't originate in modern times. Medieval texts reference a vessel of fire hidden beneath the holy site, guarded by angels feared by kings. Some believe the Templars went looking for it, but others think they found something even more destabilizing: not an object, but evidence. Evidence of a sacred lineage. This is where the bloodline theory resurfaces. The belief that Jesus survived the crucifixion, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally, and that his descendants continued protected in secret. It's a theory most theologians reject, but buried within a few early Christian texts, those not sanctioned by the Church, are vague references to the living branch and the seed of the teacher. Phrases easily dismissed as metaphor, unless they're not. One lesser-known Templar account, preserved in a 13th century Cistercian codex, refers cryptically to the chamber of light beneath the walls of Zion, where the two paths met. It's poetic, yes, but the phrase two paths has raised scholarly eyebrows. Duality mortal and divine. Some interpret it as a reference to Jesus' nature. Others more daringly suggest it hints at two legacies: faith and family. But what if the Templars uncovered documents, scrolls sealed in clay, inscriptions etched into limestone, fragments of early Christian tradition preserved not in Rome, but in Jerusalem, far from the political machinery of the Western Church? Documents that offered a different version of events, unfiltered, unedited, deeply inconvenient. There's no proof, of course, just patterns. Patterns in the architectural choices the Templars made. Their recurring emphasis on octagons, a shape linked not just to resurrection, but to the geometry of transition. Their fondness for underground chapels and mirrored spaces. Their silence about what, if anything, they unearthed. It's easy to dismiss this all as medieval romanticism, until you notice the consistency. Independent sources from different regions and centuries echoing the same idea that something was removed from beneath the Temple Mount. Something never shown, never declared, and that after its discovery, the order changed. They became richer, yes, but also more secretive. Their rituals more arcane. Their symbols more abstract, almost as if they were no longer serving only the Church, but something older. Or someone. Even within the ranks, not all were given access to the full truth. Only the highest, perhaps, only the Grand Master himself may have known the full scope of what had been found. That kind of knowledge would be dangerous, heretical, world-altering. And yet, if such a discovery had been made, if beneath the rock and dust beneath the very bones of Solomon's temple, there lay a story untold, then it raises a question, not just about the past, but about the present. Where did it go? You were probably told that Jesus vanished for a while. Not in the supernatural sense, but in a more bureaucratic one. His childhood ends abruptly in the gospel narrative, and then quite suddenly he reappears around the age of 30, ready for baptism and ministry. That's a long time to leave a biography blank. 18 years, nearly 2 decades of silence from the most heavily studied figure in human history. And within that void lies fertile ground for every manner of theory, including one that seems to have echoed quietly, persistently, throughout the ranks of the Knights Templar. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus appears as a 12-year-old in the temple, debating with scholars. And then, nothing. The next scene is the River Jordan. No apprenticeship, no travels, no diary entries. Just a theological time jump. But not all traditions accept that gap so passively. In various Eastern Christian sects, as well as certain apocryphal writings, stories persist of Jesus traveling east to Persia, to India, even to the Himalayas, absorbing the wisdom of mystic sages and ancient rites long buried in the sands of empire. For a long time, these ideas were relegated to the margins, dismissed as spiritual tourism or 19th century invention. But there is one curious record that won't quite go away. In the archives of Hemis Monastery in Ladakh, tucked into the Himalayan mountains, an 1894 report by Russian journalist Nicholas Notovich claimed the existence of ancient scrolls describing the life of Saint Isa, a holy man from Israel who studied Buddhism and returned to his homeland to teach. The Catholic Church dismissed the claim immediately. The manuscript has never resurfaced. But the story lingered, whispering of a Jesus who walked among other teachers and whose understanding of divinity came through experience, not only inheritance. Why would the Templars care? Because they were known to seek out heretical knowledge, or at least knowledge that didn't fit Rome's preferred narrative. And if Jesus had in fact traveled and taught and perhaps even fathered children during that missing period, then the silence wasn't just an omission, it was a cover. One lesser-known detail that complicates things further is the Templars' recorded interest in Eastern Christian communities. During their time in the Holy Land, they frequently interacted with Nestorians, Copts, Jacobites, and other Christian sects considered unorthodox by Rome. These groups preserved older traditions, oral histories, gospels excluded from the canon, and even interpretations of Christ that emphasized his humanity, his family ties, and his earthly experiences. In fact, some Templar chaplains are known to have translated or copied texts now considered part of the Apocrypha. A few of these texts mention a teacher who walked with the river tribes and saw the snow god's mountain before his mission began. Vague, yes, but evocative, especially when taken alongside architectural motifs found in Templar chapels, strange Eastern flourishes, spirals, inverted lotuses, symbols that feel out of place in a Catholic military order. One document uncovered in southern France in the 1800s, attributed to a Templar initiate, refers to the Book of the Life between allegedly a scroll kept hidden in a chapel under Montségur. The book, the document claims, revealed the teachings of the young Jesus while he traveled among the Essenes, and beyond teachings the Church considered too mystical, too humanizing, and possibly too genealogical. Because here's the thread that keeps resurfacing, woven quietly into every whispered tale, that Jesus may have married during his missing years, that he may have fathered children, and that the story of the bloodline didn't begin after Golgotha, but before the Jordan. Naturally, this idea has been weaponized, commercialized, and distorted over time. Fictional thrillers have muddied the waters, but long before any of that, Templar legends told of a sacred duty not just to defend the faith, but to protect a legacy. And if part of that legacy included preserving hidden knowledge about Jesus' life, his travels, and his offspring, then the missing years become not an accident, but a deliberate redaction. And this is where scholarly debate still swirls like desert wind. Some historians argue the gap is typical for the era ancient biographies often skip youth. Others point to cultural discomfort with portraying Jesus in too human a light. But a small, stubborn minority insists that silence is too clean, too surgical, that something was removed. You've already walked through their hidden chambers and dusty rituals. The Templars weren't fools. They knew the difference between myth and meaning. If they believed that Jesus lived longer, wandered farther, and left behind more than teachings, then their entire mission takes on new gravity. They weren't just protecting a secret. They were protecting a timeline. And as you trace it back one grainy footstep at a time, you begin to wonder if the trail didn't begin beneath the Temple Mount, but in the snowy valleys of the Far East, in stories never meant to be canon, and in scrolls lost not by chance but by intention. She appears at the edge of every crucial moment, at the tomb, at the cross, at the moment of resurrection. And yet, for centuries, Mary Magdalene has been treated as a footnote, a woman defined more by repentance than relevance. But scratch the surface of the canonical texts, and something begins to shift. She isn't simply present, she's central. She's the first to see the risen Christ. She's the first to speak of it, and for the Knights Templar, her role may have held more than spiritual weight. It may have pointed to something hereditary. It's a historical fact that in the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is the first to witness the resurrection. That alone would qualify her as an apostle by most theological standards. But in the 4th century, a deliberate rebranding occurred. She was fused artfully ambiguously with other women in the Gospels: the woman caught in adultery, the woman who anoints Jesus' feet, the sinner. The result was a composite character, penitent, broken emotionally, evocative, but distanced from leadership. The Church's reasoning may have been doctrinal, or it may have been protective. That's where things grow murky, and for the Templars, perhaps tantalizing. Several Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, present a radically different portrait. In them, Mary Magdalene is not merely close to Jesus, she is his confidant, his interpreter, his equal. One fragment in the Gospel of Philip describes her as the companion of the Savior and says that he loved her more than all the disciples and kissed her often on the mouth. The line has been the subject of intense debate, revision, and outright erasure. And while some claim it's a spiritual metaphor, others, particularly in circles aligned with esoteric Christianity, believe the phrase implies something more intimate. For the Templars, who revered certain apocryphal traditions and were deeply connected to early French interpretations of Christianity, Mary Magdalene was not a fallen woman. She was the Grail, not the cup, the womb. That idea would be heretical today, and even more so in the 12th century. Yet in southern France, especially in the region of Provence, legends persisted that Mary Magdalene fled Judea after the crucifixion and arrived by boat along with several companions, possibly including a child. In the town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer, an annual pilgrimage still honors this arrival. Local traditions speak of her preaching, living in seclusion, and passing on a hidden teaching. And just a few miles away lies the cave of Saint-Baume, where it's said she spent her final years in contemplation. A lonely detail, or a strategic exile. Here's where it bends toward Bloodline. Some French genealogies from the early medieval period mention red-haired queens or ladies of the sea who carried sacred lineage. These aren't official histories. They're tucked into side notes and monastery records, often written in cautious Latin, as if hedging a dangerous memory. A few even trace a line from Magdalene to the Merovingians, the first kings of France, whose legitimacy was always a little mystical, said to be born of sea creatures with healing gifts and visions. But what if that mythology was camouflage? What if the miracle wasn't metaphor but ancestry? That idea didn't die. It embedded itself in secret orders, some of which aligned with the Templars in both theology and blood. The Priory of Sion, assuming it ever existed in the form legends claim, was one such group. So was the Ordre de l'Étoile, which revered the Queen of the Grail. A veiled title, perhaps, or a coded reference to Mary Magdalene herself. One obscure but real 12th century manuscript from Languedoc contains a line that has sparked endless argument. And she bore the light of the Nazarene into the lands of Gaul, where it would remain in silence, but not in sleep. Silence, but not in sleep. A poetic way to describe dormancy, or a hidden family line. The Templars operated heavily in this region. They built commanderies, chapels, and safe houses, many of them around sites linked to Magdalene legends. Coincidence is the polite explanation. But some researchers believe those sites served as sanctuaries not for treasure but for people, for descendants, custodians, survivors of a secret that could unravel the foundations of ecclesiastical authority. Naturally, modern scholars dispute the connection. There is no conclusive proof of a marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, but there is also no explicit denial in the earliest texts. Just silence. And in historical terms, silence, especially around women, often speaks volumes. If the Templars saw Mary not as a disciple but as a bloodline bearer, it would explain their obsession with symbols of femininity in certain contexts. The Black Madonna statues, the crescent moon motifs, the recurring imagery of a woman cradling a child beneath stone arches, not typical knightly fare, unless their definition of holy was more inclusive, more hereditary. And so the question deepens. Was Mary Magdalene the first witness or the first mother? There are voices missing from the Bible. Not just faint ones, but entire gospels, whole accounts of Jesus' life teachings and followers that were banished from the canon before most people even knew they existed. The decisions made at councils behind closed doors and across centuries of theological gatekeeping ensured that only certain versions of the story would survive. But fragments remain. Papyrus pages buried in desert jars, half-erased lines quoted by later critics, and among these some of the most provocative words ever written about Jesus and his inner circle words the Templars may have seen studied and protected. It's a historical fact that the modern New Testament contains only 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in the early centuries of Christianity, dozens circulated. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas. Each offered a different perspective, and each was eventually declared heretical, not necessarily because they were provably false, but because they didn't conform. Take the Gospel of Thomas. It presents Jesus not as a Messiah to worship, but as a teacher revealing divine knowledge already within you, a spiritual equalizer. No miracles, no passion narrative, just a string of sayings, some cryptic, some comforting, some radical. Then there's the Gospel of Philip, which we've touched before, with its bold claim that Jesus shared a sacred, intimate bond with Mary Magdalene. It even uses the word koinonos, a Greek term closer to spouse or partner than disciple. That single term has caused more sleepless nights among theologians than most entire epistles. Now imagine you're a Templar. You've sworn vows of poverty and chastity, yes, but you're also literate elite and in many cases more curious than obedient. You operate in the Holy Land, where Eastern Christians preserve texts older than Rome's doctrine. You trade knowledge with Coptic monks, Syriac translators, Armenian scribes, and maybe, just maybe, you come across scrolls that tell a different story. A human Jesus, a loving Jesus, a father, a husband, a legacy. Some historians dismiss this as fantasy. Others point to the Nag Hammadi library discovered in 1945 as evidence that these Gospels were very real, very old, and very inconvenient. The Coptic manuscripts found in those jars hidden in the Egyptian desert contain not only Gnostic teachings, but radical reinterpretations of Christ's message. Salvation comes not through blood sacrifice, but through knowledge, through memory, through recognition of the divine spark passed down not in parables, but perhaps genetically. This is where the bloodline theory meets parchment. One obscure detail emerges from a 13th century Templar charter found in Aragon, Spain. Among the inventory of a commandery's holdings, there is mention of a text of the sacred bond believed to be a reference to a lost gospel or epistle that detailed the marriage of the Nazarene and his chosen. The phrasing is vague, possibly coded, but it matches a recurring pattern veiled language for dangerous ideas. If such a text existed, it would need protection. And what better place to hide it than behind armor oaths and cathedrals? The Templars had both the means and the motive. Their growing independence from the Church, coupled with their rumored access to forbidden writings, may have made them both stewards and heretics in the eyes of Rome. The Church, for its part, launched aggressive campaigns against Gnostic contamination. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE had already set the tone, but subsequent councils further narrowed the canon and doubled down on enforcement. Even owning certain texts could be a death sentence. This is why so many scrolls ended up buried, physically hidden in caves beneath monastery floors or inside stone walls. They weren't discarded. They were preserved for someone. And that someone in some versions of the story is the Templar order. The scholarly debate over the authenticity of these Gospels continues. Some view them as late inventions. Others see them as parallel traditions, no less valid, merely less political. But regardless of their origin, they share a trait that makes traditionalists sweat. They present a Jesus too close, too personal, too involved in the world he allegedly transcended. This would explain why certain Templar chapels include imagery at odds with Catholic orthodoxy murals of men and women seated equally around a central figure. Depictions of the Last Supper with Mary at Jesus' side hand clasped in his, not as a token, as a partner. These aren't universal, but where they appear, they speak volumes. And then there's the laughable irony: many of the Gospels the Church sought to destroy survived longer because they were erased. Their absence made them desirable. Their suppression made them powerful. And the moment someone unearthed them, centuries later, they came roaring back into modern consciousness, bearing questions we still don't know how to answer. Were the Templars custodians of one or more of these texts? Did they read a different gospel, one that made Jesus not just a savior, but a patriarch? Perhaps that's why they built churches shaped like octagons, like circles broken open. Why they inscribed stars within stars. Why their secrecy wasn't just about gold or ritual, but about knowledge. Uncomfortable, destabilizing knowledge. And if that knowledge included a gospel where Jesus speaks not of sacrifice but of legacy, then maybe the real heresy wasn't the text. It was the truth. They arrived with little fanfare, no bannered army, and no clear explanation. Just 9 knights, mostly from French noble families, swearing oaths of poverty and obedience, pledging themselves to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. On the surface, it all seemed rather noble, humble even, but historians have long puzzled over the strange simplicity of their beginning. No resources, no hierarchy, no support structure, And yet, within a few short years, these 9 men would become the nucleus of the most powerful and mysterious military order in medieval Europe. Which begs the question, what did they really come to Jerusalem to do? A well-established fact, the Templar order was officially founded in 1119 by Hugues de Payens and 8 fellow knights. They took their vows before the Patriarch of Jerusalem and were granted quarters on the Temple Mount by King Baldwin II. That in itself is odd. Jerusalem was a city teeming with religious orders, military garrisons, and political complexities. Yet this tiny, untested band was given access to one of the most symbolically potent sites in human history, the ruins of Solomon's Temple. No training, no real oversight, just permission. Historians often cite urgency and a lack of manpower in the region, but the location alone has led some to suspect that their mission wasn't merely protection, it was recovery, or guardianship, or both. Among the founding 9 were men with curious backgrounds. Hugues de Payens was of noble descent, but very little is recorded about his early life. Godfrey de Saint-Omer may have been related to families tied to the early Merovingian bloodline. André de Montbard was an uncle of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful and theologically influential figures of the era. That last connection is particularly striking. Bernard would go on to draft the Rule of the Templars and secure papal endorsement for the order. But why such swift interest in 9 obscure knights? One theory suggests that these men were hand-picked, not just for their martial abilities, but for their ancestry. That the founding 9 weren't simply brave souls volunteering for service, but descendants of families with long-kept secrets, ancient manuscripts, or ties to a suppressed legacy. In other words, this wasn't the birth of an order, it was the activation of a plan. The Templars were known to be intensely secretive. Initiates underwent strange rituals. Certain ranks within the order remained deliberately opaque even to other Templars. There were rumors of inner circles within inner circles groups, with knowledge not shared with the rank and file. If the founding 9 had recovered or were searching for documents related to Jesus' bloodline or hidden teachings, such secrecy would make sense. It would also explain the swift protection granted to them by both church and state protection that came long before they had any military success to show for it. One obscure but illuminating detail comes from a letter attributed to Bishop Guillaume of Tyre, written decades after the order's founding. He describes the early Templars as men of the mount, not of the sword, a phrase that has puzzled translators. Taken literally, it suggests they were more interested in what lay beneath their feet than what stood before them. Taken symbolically, it hints at esoteric pursuits, gnosis, knowledge, legacy. There's also the curious way the order expanded. Unlike other military units, the Templars spread through a network of commanderies, autonomous strongholds that reported directly to the Grand Master, bypassing local bishops and lords. This allowed them to move people, goods, and most notably information across continents without interference. Some researchers believe that included the movement of relics, manuscripts, and even bloodline custodians. And then there's the case of the Temple Mount excavations previously touched upon. If those digs occurred, and there's substantial circumstantial evidence they did, then it would have been these founding knights who carried them out. Which means they may have been the first to lay eyes on what had been hidden for centuries. The Ark. The scrolls, a burial chamber, a genealogy. The scholarly debate rages. Some say these men were merely idealists, swept up in crusading fervor. Others suspect a more deliberate purpose. After all, 9 is not a random number. In esoteric traditions, it symbolizes completeness. The final digit before repetition, the sacred triad multiplied. In Gnostic texts, 9 represents the spheres of heaven. In early Christian numerology, it was linked to initiation. If the founding nine were chosen not by accident, but by design, their true role may have been less about safeguarding roads and more about safeguarding a revelation. And perhaps that's why they disappeared from official records just as quickly as they rose. What they may have found known or passed on didn't enter history books. It entered vaults, oral traditions, coded symbology, and eventually suppression. What's certain is that after their initial years in Jerusalem, the Templars exploded in influence. Land, wealth, immunity. Almost as if someone was rewarding them for services rendered. But if those services involved uncovering a bloodline, then the founding nine were not just knights. They were guardians of something far more fragile than stone or gold. At first glance, it looked like a divine alliance, a military order forged in faith endorsed by the holiest authority on earth. The Knights Templar and the Roman Catholic Church, two arms of God's will working in unison to protect Christendom. That's the story told in sermons and textbooks. But behind the gilded proclamations and ceremonial blessings, there's a deeper arrangement. One that smells less of incense and more of quiet negotiation. Because while the Church gave the Templars unprecedented power, it also granted them an unusual freedom. And when has Rome ever been known for sharing power unless it absolutely had to? It's a historical fact that in 1139 Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull known as Omni Datum Optimum, which granted the Knights Templar complete autonomy from local religious authorities. They could collect tithes, build chapels, and operate outside the jurisdiction of bishops. They answered only to the Pope himself. To put that into perspective, even kings were expected to obey their regional clergy. The Templars exempt, free agents with swords. This is not typical ecclesiastical behavior, and the timing is telling. By 1139, the Templars had only been active for 20 years. No massive battles, no sprawling armies. Yet suddenly they were elevated to the status of a sovereign religious institution. It wasn't just power, it was insulation, a spiritual diplomatic immunity, and with it came silence. Now, if you're inclined to think generously, this could have been a reward for loyalty. But many believe it was a transaction, a pact. One that might have had less to do with protecting pilgrims and more to do with guarding something the Vatican couldn't possess directly. Something ancient, something heretical, something genetic. Let's rewind. The Church by the 12th century was locked in a delicate balancing act. It held Europe in a doctrinal grip, but was constantly under siege by regional heresies, theological dissent, and competing sources of spiritual authority. The idea of a bloodline descending from Christ, especially one that bypassed church control, would have been the nuclear option. It would reduce the Pope to a custodian of ritual, not the inheritor of divine succession. So what if the Vatican suspected the existence of this bloodline, or at least the documentation of it, but couldn't acknowledge it without unraveling its own authority? Enter the Templars. They were the perfect solution. Zealous enough to be trusted, independent enough to be distanced, capable of military discretion, fluent in the languages of secrecy and stone. If they did uncover something in Jerusalem, scrolls, relics, remains, what better way to protect it than to quietly sanction the guardians? The obscure detail that supports this theory lies in an unusual document issued from the Lateran archives. It's a short letter from Pope Alexander III to a regional bishop, dated around 1170, instructing him not to interfere with the affairs of the soldiers of the temple, for their charge is known only to the Holy See. That phrase, known only to the Holy See, has puzzled scholars for years. It could simply refer to administrative matters, or it could suggest something more delicate. Consider this: most religious orders were monitored closely, especially when they amassed wealth or deviated from orthodoxy. The Templars, not only were they unmonitored, but they were also praised, celebrated, publicly endorsed by Bernard of Clairvaux, who compared them to bees, humble servants, busy with holy purpose. But bees also keep secrets in the hive. The more the Templars expanded, the more uneasy the Church seemed to become. Subtle tensions began to rise. Accusations of heresy would emerge later, of course, but even in their prime whispers circulated that the Knights conducted strange rites, that they had their own gospel, that they bowed before a head or kissed at forbidden places. Interpretations vary wildly, but what remains consistent is the Church's hesitancy to intervene until it absolutely had to. Some argue that the Templars became too powerful. Others think they became too knowing. Which brings us back to the pact. If the Templars had possession of records or artifacts that proved the existence of a Christic bloodline, one unbroken, undocumented, and entirely outside the Vatican's control, then the Church would have faced a crisis. Not only of faith, but of politics. Imagine if a child of that line were alive in France, or Spain, or cloistered in the Pyrenees. What would it mean for succession, for power, for the authority to forgive sins? The arrangement then may have been simple: the Templars protect what they found. The Church looks away. So long as the knowledge remains buried, both figuratively and literally, everyone remains safe. But knowledge has a habit of leaking, especially when inscribed in stone or whispered across generations. The scholarly debate centers on whether such a bloodline could have remained hidden. Most reject the notion entirely. Yet none can explain the peculiar way in which the Templars were simultaneously exalted and cordoned off, empowered by the Pope, but isolated from his bureaucratic machinery. It's as if they were being kept close, but not too close. And that delicate dance blessing and boundary power and distance may have been the truest sign of all. Not of guilt, but of fear. The stones don't shout. They murmur. Beneath layers of history, beneath the dust of time and conquest, the Knights Templar left messages not in words, but in carvings, alignments, architectural riddles. And though most visitors to their former chapels and strongholds walk past these symbols without a second glance, those who pause, those who look closer, begin to sense a pattern. It's not always what's there, but how it's placed, what's missing, what repeats. Because the Templars, it seems, were not only builders of fortresses, but stewards of symbols. And some of those symbols may point to the very secret they were sworn to guard. One undeniable historical fact is that the Templars, unlike many of their contemporaries, favored circular and octagonal churches. While most Catholic architecture leaned toward the Latin cross floor plan, Templar chapels like the Temple Church in London or the Church of La Vera Cruz in Spain echoed the shape of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. The same dome that stands atop the Temple Mount. The same mount under which the earliest Templars lived and allegedly dug. Coincidence, perhaps. But octagons weren't just aesthetic. In early Christian and Gnostic thought, the octagon represented transition, the bridge between earth symbolized by the square and heaven, the circle. A liminal space, a threshold. And thresholds, as any guardian knows, are for keeping something in or keeping something out. In many Templar sites, carvings depict two knights riding a single horse, often explained as a symbol of poverty and brotherhood. But to others, it suggests duality. Two truths in one vessel, mortal and divine, body and bloodline. It's a quiet icon, but once you've seen it in the context of this theory, it lingers like a question you're no longer sure how to answer. Then there are the crosses. The standard Templar cross is red, equal-armed, simple. But variations emerge in different locations, crosses pate flared at the edges like unfolding petals. In some sites, these crosses are etched into stone at precise compass points. In others, they're carved alongside curious botanical motifs, stylized roses, vines, lilies. Some believe these weren't just decorative flourishes, but references to something living, something passed on. An obscure carving found in the Templar commandery of Tamar, Portugal, depicts what appears to be a tree whose roots descend into a geometric well. The branches form 7 points, the roots 12. Scholars have debated this for years, but among fringe historians the symbolism is tantalizing. 7 branches, perhaps the divine message. 12 roots, the bloodline, apostles, or descendants. And then there are the graffitied images that don't belong at all. In Dôme, France, a prison once used to hold Templar captives is lined with carvings made by the knights themselves, etched by hand during their final years. Among the familiar images, crosses, stars, swords, are faces. Not just any faces, but maternal figures. Some scholars interpret these as renderings of the Virgin Mary, but others note the absence of typical Marian iconography. No halo, no infant. Just a woman, sometimes with flowing hair, often surrounded by symbols of nature. If these figures were intended to represent Mary Magdalene instead, then their presence in a prison cell is an act of quiet defiance. Not despair, but devotion. The Templars were also fond of encoded language. In the ruins of their sites, you'll occasionally find inscriptions written in Atbash, a Hebrew cipher that reverses the alphabet. One such phrase found near Rennes-le-Château spells out Makom, a Hebrew word for place, but also used in mystical Judaism to refer to the divine presence. In context, the inscription sits beneath a worn star, 6-pointed, not 5, the Star of David, or perhaps 2 triangles, masculine and feminine, intertwined. All of this could be symbolic noise, coincidences stacked like stones. But when you track the repetition, the placements, the way these motifs show up specifically in locations tied to early Templar activities, especially near Jerusalem and in southern France, a story starts to emerge. Not shouted, not written, but carved into silence. And it's here that academic debate splits once again. Some argue that these symbols are misinterpreted, that we're projecting meaning onto medieval graffiti. Others insist that symbolism was the language of the time. In an age of illiteracy and persecution, imagery became code. Geometry became gospel. And if the Templars were guarding a secret that could not be spoken aloud, it would have to be hidden in stone, preserved in form, passed along by those who knew how to read the signs. Like a trail of breadcrumbs, but set in mortar. One Templar manuscript held in private hands and rarely shown is said to describe the great diagram of the line, a map of symbols and locations that traces the movement of a sacred legacy across Europe. It has never been authenticated. It may never surface. But those who've glimpsed its contents say the key is not what's written, but what's drawn. So you begin to wonder, did the Templars construct their churches not just to glorify God, but to point, to preserve, to encode? Did the angles, the carvings, the stonework itself form a language? And if so, what message were they leaving behind, not just a symbol of faith, but a roadmap of blood? You can almost hear the crack of the clay as it splits open, dust tumbling free from a sealed jar, untouched for nearly 2,000 years. That was 1947 when a young Bedouin shepherd stumbled upon the first of what would become the greatest manuscript discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But long before archaeologists lifted those brittle fragments from the caves at Qumran, Long before scholars began to decipher the ancient Hebrew and Aramaic scripts, the Templars may have already known these writings existed. More than that, they may have read them and found in them the seeds of a secret worth guarding for centuries. Historically, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a massive and complex collection, over 900 documents from the Second Temple period, including portions of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible, as well as previously unknown psalms, sectarian writings, and apocalyptic visions. Among them are texts attributed to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes, who lived in austere isolation, preserving their law and awaiting a messianic figure, sometimes even two. One priestly, one kingly, a dual anointed line. That duality echoes strangely with Templar symbolism: the sword and the staff, the warrior and the mystic. Two paths converging in one sacred cause. A fact, no, but a reflection worth squinting at. The caves of Qumran lie near the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea, a remote and windswept region in Judea. During the Crusades, this area was often bypassed by larger armies, but not by all. A 12th century Arab chronicle mentions a band of foreign knights seen moving through the cliffs near Ein Gedi, not fighting, but searching. No one thought much of it at the time. The region was riddled with ruins. But in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls' eventual discovery, that centuries-old footnote now carries new weight. If the Templars did come across any fragments smuggled through local contacts, traded with desert tribes, or even retrieved from hidden caches, the question is, why would they care? Because among the scrolls are texts that reshape the narrative. They describe a teacher of righteousness, betrayed by a wicked priest, language that echoes eerily the New Testament structure. Some scholars believe the teacher of righteousness may have been a proto-messianic figure, or even an early depiction of Jesus himself, filtered through pre-Christian Jewish tradition. More compelling still is the scroll of the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, a dramatic, almost mythic account of a cosmic battle. Not metaphorical, but literal, naming camps, strategies, rituals. The kind of text a militarized religious order might find oddly familiar or inspirational. Then there's the copper scroll, unique among the Qumran documents for being etched not in parchment, but in metal. It lists dozens of hidden treasures buried across ancient Israel. Most scholars treat it as an inventory of sacred temple artifacts, but others suggest it's a coded map. Perhaps even a red herring. Perhaps a decoy placed to guard something else entirely. And here's where the threads twist tighter. One lesser-known manuscript, dubbed 4Q285 by scholars, includes a passage that refers to a branch of David who will execute judgment upon the nations. The phrasing blurs the lines between political king and spiritual Messiah. In traditional Christian doctrine, Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. But what if the Templars read it another way? Not as prophecy fulfilled, but as lineage continued. If the Messiah was a branch, perhaps his bloodline still extended. Perhaps the tree was still growing quietly, dangerously. A controversial theory dismissed by most academics suggests that certain scrolls found at Qumran were moved, copied, dispersed, or hidden elsewhere before the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. If true, some may have ended up in Jerusalem itself, sealed beneath the Temple Mount. And if the Templars dug there, as so many believe, well, you begin to see how the timelines could intersect. Even in modern scholarship, debate simmers. Some argue that the Essenes had nothing to do with early Christianity. Others insist they were precursors, perhaps even protectors. What's less argued is that the scrolls offer a wider, weirder context for the world Jesus inhabited, one in which messiahs were not rare. Resurrection was expected, and secret knowledge could be deadly. So imagine being a Templar commander handed a brittle page covered in a language half forgotten, and realizing what it suggests: that Jesus was not singular, that his message was part of something older, that his life was a continuation, not an exception. And maybe, just maybe, that life didn't end in a tomb. It's a thread too dangerous to pull. Yet someone did, and the result was an order that spoke in symbols carved in silence and built its faith not only on scripture, but on secrets. Did they find the scrolls? There's no record. No parchment signed, found by Hugues de Payens, 1120. But what the Templars left behind, their rituals, their architecture, their swift rise and brutal fall, speaks of knowledge gained too fast, and of truths the Church was not ready to include in its canon. Maybe they weren't meant to be included at all. The Templars lived atop a riddle. Their Jerusalem headquarters, granted by King Baldwin II, sat directly over what once had been the Second Temple beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque. To the outside world, it was a convenient location. But behind its ancient stones, within its subterranean hollows, a darker whisper grew that below their feet lay a hidden chamber. A vault sealed long before the Crusaders arrived. A place not marked on maps, but kept alive in murmurs and secrecy. And perhaps a place where everything changed. The Temple Mount is no stranger to hidden spaces. Generations of conquerors built atop one another, leaving a tangle of foundations, cisterns, and corridors beneath its surface. But during the Templars' occupation, reports began to circulate, faint, second-hand, often dismissed, of deliberate digging. No official records describe what was found. Yet decades later, travelers recorded peculiar stories of knights descending into the bedrock of relics unearthed and quickly hidden, of a chamber few were allowed to enter and fewer returned from. The historical facts we can confirm begin with architecture. The Al-Aqsa Mosque's foundations contain earlier stonework, some Herodian, some possibly older. Beneath it lie vaults and passageways known today as Solomon's Stables, though the name is a misnomer. In the 12th century, these vast underground spaces were controlled entirely by the Templars. They stored supplies there, yes, but some believe they also found a deeper level. A 13th century Arabic manuscript refers to a sealed room of lights hidden beneath the Crusader structure on the Mount. It does not name the Templars directly, but the timing and location match. The phrase "room of lights" is often interpreted as metaphor, but to certain initiates in mystic traditions, it suggests something more specific: a space containing scrolls, candles, ritual, and presence. A sanctum, not a treasury. A reliquary of ideas. One obscure Templar account, never formally verified, survives in a 17th century compilation of ecclesiastical legends. It describes a ceremony held in the Great Hollow beneath Jerusalem, where 9 men formed a circle around a stone slab engraved with a symbol of 2 entwined fish. In Christian iconography, fish typically reference Christ, but entwined, that's new. Some scholars believe it may allude to dual natures, divine and human, or even to 2 bloodlines, the sacred and the safeguarded. Here's where it deepens. In 1867, long after the Templars were dust, British explorer Charles Warren conducted excavations beneath the Temple Mount. He discovered shafts, chambers, and passageways previously unknown to European archaeologists. In one report, Warren noted a chamber inaccessible except by rope, and described the air as still and oppressive, as though sealed for centuries. He found no treasure, but he wasn't the first to look. What makes Warren's account intriguing is a peculiar detail carved above the chamber's entrance was a symbol almost erased of a 5-petaled rose. This image recurs in Templar iconography, often associated with secrecy, silence, and sacred feminine power. If this symbol marked the entrance to a hidden room, it suggests something more than storage. It suggests intention and reverence. The Vatican, of course, has never acknowledged any such chamber. But if a hidden room beneath Al-Aqsa did contain documents, scrolls from the Essenes genealogies of early Christians, or even artifacts tied to Mary Magdalene or Jesus himself, it would present a crisis of unimaginable proportions. For the Church, for history, for faith. That's why some argue the Templars never shared what they found. If they did recover evidence of a sacred bloodline or teachings contrary to established doctrine, they would have needed time generations to interpret, protect, and possibly obscure it. Hence their strange mix of military rigor and mystical symbols. Hence their independence. Hence their downfall. One scholar writing in the early 20th century proposed that the secret chamber contained not objects, but bones. Human remains carefully buried, wrapped in linen accompanied by engraved tablets. The kind of find that would require absolute silence. The kind of find that could prove a bloodline. But we don't know. And we may never know. What we do know is this: the Templars lived for decades above one of the holiest sites in the world. They controlled access. They shaped the space. And when they left nothing behind. Or at least nothing visible. Because if they did find a hidden chamber beneath Al-Aqsa, then what mattered most wasn't what was in it. It was what they took away. They lived in silence, wrapped in linen and prayer, carving their days into the limestone cliffs near the Dead Sea. The Essenes, a reclusive Jewish sect from the Second Temple period, practiced ritual purity, communal living, and a brand of apocalyptic prophecy that terrified temple priests and thrilled later mystics. But to the Knights Templar, the Essenes may have represented something else entirely a key. Not just to a forgotten religious tradition, but to a living thread, one that led straight to Jesus. Or more precisely, to a version of Jesus the Church tried hard to forget. Historically, the Essenes are best known through three sources: the writings of Philo, Pliny, the Elder, and Josephus. All describe a peculiar community living near the Dead Sea, especially at Qumran. They rejected temple corruption, lived ascetically, and awaited a messianic figure, sometimes two. This dual Messiah concept is where things start to align uncomfortably with early Christian theology. A priestly Messiah to restore righteousness. A kingly Messiah to lead and rule. Sound familiar? Now here's where the Templars enter the frame. During their time in the Holy Land, the Templars had unprecedented access to Christian and Jewish communities outside Rome's influence. Nestorians, Copts, and remnants of older traditions shared stories that hadn't been polished by Latin scribes. In these stories, Jesus wasn't an anomaly. He was the fulfillment of a Essene prophecy, a teacher of righteousness, raised in their ways, preaching a message far too radical for temple authorities to tolerate. The Dead Sea Scrolls attributed to the Essenes never mention Jesus by name. But they do describe a figure known as the teacher of righteousness, who was betrayed, persecuted, and expected to return. Whether this figure was Jesus or a prototype that inspired the gospel narrative remains debated. But to the Templars, who likely encountered these stories through oral tradition or hidden texts, the resonance must have been striking. One obscure manuscript from the early 13th century, uncovered in Languedoc, describes a Templar brother who had spent many nights by the salt sea hearing the prayers of the Sons of Light. The phrase Sons of Light is not random, it's a direct echo of the Dead Sea Scrolls War Scroll, which outlines a cosmic conflict between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. Whether this Templar actually met a surviving Essene offshoot or simply received a lineage of their teachings is unclear, but the reference is deliberate. The Templars weren't just defending pilgrims. They were investigating echoes. And perhaps that's why so many of their rituals, when viewed with modern eyes, carry a distinctly Essene flavor. A focus on purification. Initiatory silence. Brotherhood not based on birth or status, but on spiritual discipline. Even their architectural choices, isolated chapels, circular spaces, and underground sanctuaries mirror the cave dwellings and ceremonial chambers of Qumran. Then there's the matter of the hidden teacher. Some fringe researchers believe the Essenes preserved not only prophecy, but a bloodline, a family line descended from David, protected in secret, kept alive in expectation of the messianic role. If Jesus was that figure, then his identity wasn't spontaneous. It was cultivated. And after his death, or supposed death, his followers may have continued this protection in the form of an unbroken lineage. This theory gains traction in southern France, where Cathar and Templar communities coexisted for generations. In Cathar cosmology, Christ was spirit and man married and ascended. Certain Cathar texts even hint at the child of the white dove, a poetic title for a spiritual heir. In these communities, Jesus' bloodline wasn't just possible, it was sacred. The Templars, operating between the structured theology of Rome and the wild territories of mystic tradition, may have served as the bridge, guardians of a teaching too dangerous to declare, protectors of a lineage too explosive to reveal. One peculiar detail supports this. In a 14th century inventory of Templar relics seized during their trials, a small scroll was listed bound in lead and marked with a fish symbol. Its contents are lost. But the fish, as we've seen, was a symbol for Jesus, yet entwined fish, as seen in Templar art, may have also meant something more: unity, duality, continuation. And this is where scholarly debate veers off the rails. Traditional academics argue there's no direct link between Jesus and the Essenes, much less between the Templars and Qumran's vanished mystics. But silence isn't absence. And when orders like the Templars operated beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, what matters isn't just what they said. It's what they built, where they built, what symbols they carved when they thought no one was watching. Because sometimes the teacher returns not in thunder or trumpet, but in stone. The wind in the Pyrenees whispers like parchment torn in slow motion. Perched atop a jagged summit in southern France, Montségur is more than a fortress. It's a mausoleum of memory. Once a stronghold for the Cathars, the so-called heretical Christians of Languedoc, it was also a place where something slipped through the fire. According to legend, in the final days before the fortress fell in 1244, a small group escaped under the cover of night carrying a mysterious bundle documents, some say wrapped in oilskin. Templar documents. Records not meant to survive. And yet, they did. Let's start with what we know. Montségur was a Cathar refuge, a near-impossible fortress to breach. The Cathars believed in dualism, spirit and flesh, light and darkness, and saw the physical world as a prison. Their beliefs drew heavy fire from the church. But the Templars, curiously, they never joined in the persecution. In fact, they seemed to treat the Cathars not as heretics, but as distant cousins, visitors, allies. That alone is suspicious, especially when you consider that many Templars came from the very same noble families that shielded the Cathars from inquisitors. There was overlap not just in geography, but in blood, in sympathy, in silence. But the legend of the scrolls doesn't begin at Montségur. It begins in Jerusalem. If the Templars did uncover writings beneath the Temple Mount scrolls that challenged the official gospel, that documented a bloodline or an alternate messianic tradition, they couldn't carry such artifacts across hostile terrain without risk. So they did what any careful order would do: they copied them. and copied again, and entrusted those copies to safe houses along their network. Montségur, deep in Cathar territory and out of Rome's direct reach, became one such haven. An obscure 14th-century Occitan ballad preserved in fragments speaks of the parchment sealed in flame whose truth will wake the lion's heir. That sounds dramatic, even poetic, but consider the possibility that this was code. A reference to scrolls entrusted to firekeepers, Cathar scribes, whose community was about to be extinguished. One Templar commander, Guillaume de Sonac, is rumored to have made frequent trips to the region before 1244. While there's no surviving record of what he carried, a later inventory of a Templar commandery in Béziers makes cryptic mention of the Eastern letters. No author, no date, just that label. The scrolls were never recovered during the Inquisition raids, which leads to the next twist. On the night before Montségur fell with inquisitors closing in, and the pyres already stacked, 4 Cathar parfaits are said to have escaped down the cliff with the treasure of the church. Gold, maybe. But some testimonies describe it as too light to clink, too fragile to burn. And then they vanish into the forests of Ariège. The trail picks up again centuries later in 1753, when a cache of documents was discovered hidden in the wall of an abandoned monastery near Rennes-le-Château. Among them, partially translated Greek fragments of Aramaic and what appeared to be a Templar sigil burned into the corner of one parchment. Most of the documents were confiscated by church authorities within weeks, but one priest writing in private correspondence described them as scripts of lineage. Now here's where the scholarly debate splits. Mainstream historians dismiss the idea that the Templars ever stored scrolls in France, let alone ones tied to Jesus. They argue that such documents would have been uncovered, displayed, debunked. But others point to the deliberate silencing of similar discoveries, Gnostic texts, apocryphal gospels, and suggest that suppression doesn't mean absence. It just means someone got there first. Why Montségur? Because it was a fortress above the clouds, defended by believers who had no stake in Rome's authority. If a secret was to survive, this was where you'd hide it. Not in a city, in a stone outcrop in the sky. Some researchers believe the scrolls described a genealogy. Others believe they held ritual instructions, perhaps passed down through the Magdalene tradition. A few even whisper of a Book of the Flameborn, a document that linked Christ's descendants to certain noble houses in Occitania. And if the Templars preserved even one of these scrolls, it would explain a lot. Their sudden shift towards secrecy, their alignment with the Cathars, their stubborn refusal to hand over records even under torture, and perhaps their final stand. Because if the Vatican ever learned of these scrolls documents that contradicted centuries of doctrine that legitimized a bloodline over a church, then Montségur wasn't just a battlefield. It was the last firewall. It begins not with banners or battalions, but with shadows and silence. After the fall of Jerusalem, as the Holy Land slipped from Crusader hands, something moved west. Not just men or relics, but something quieter, something sacred. If the Templars had recovered knowledge too dangerous to declare, or blood too sacred to name, they needed refuge. And so their steps turned toward a land where secrets were already currency. Southern France, Languedoc, Cathar country, Occitania. Historically, Occitania was a world apart, a patchwork of semi-independent regions ruled by counts more loyal to their own customs than to popes or kings. Here in the 12th and 13th centuries, religious tolerance flourished, at least in comparison to the rest of Europe. Jews, Muslims, mystics, and Christians of various stripes coexisted uneasily but openly. The Cathars thrived here. Troubadours sang in tongues forbidden elsewhere. Knowledge circulated in hidden libraries, cloisters, and courts. It's not difficult to see why the Templars were drawn to this region. They didn't arrive as conquerors. They arrived as custodians. If they carried relics, scrolls, or even individuals tied to a sacred bloodline, Occitania was the natural sanctuary. Remote, autonomous, and already brimming with people who shared, or at least tolerated, alternate visions of the divine. One compelling historical fact after the loss of Acre in 1291, Templar commanderies increased noticeably in the south of France. Places like Arques, Rennes-les-Bains, and Bézieux, all near Rennes-le-Château, became Templar strongholds. These were not major strategic locations. They were remote, mountainous quiet. But they offered something far more valuable than visibility insulation. There are records of Templar ships landing on the southern coast, disembarking under cover of darkness. The manifests are sparse. Some mention sealed cargo, others simply the sacred. What exactly they carried remains unknown, but whispers began rumors of a woman cloaked in white of a child, with an Eastern name of blood, arrived by sea. That phrase appears in a 14th century Occitan chronicle attributed to a Cathar exile. The entry describes those who came with the lion sign settling in the hills, watched over by knights who bore no banners. The lion, of course, is a traditional symbol of both Judah and the Messianic line, a coincidence perhaps, or a trace. Then there's the matter of the Templar roads. Recent archaeological surveys have identified a series of unusually straight, fortified paths running between former Templar sites in southern France. These roads were not trade routes. They served no military purpose. But they connected safe houses, watchtowers, and chapels that were oddly similar in construction, often circular, often isolated, always quiet. Some researchers believe these roads formed a protection network, not for treasure, but for people. A route for something or someone being moved inland from the coast to the mountains, to keep them hidden, or to prepare them. One tantalizing piece of evidence is a 1293 land grant issued by a local noblewoman to the Templars of Bézieux. In the document, she relinquishes a vineyard and surrounding forest to those who guard the name and the flame. The phrase "guard the name" appears nowhere else in the legal archives of the time. But to those immersed in Templar lore, it resonates. Was it the name of Christ, of Magdalene, or a name the world wasn't meant to know? The scholarly debate circles endlessly. Some argue these are just colorful fables, that the idea of a literal bloodline was never more than a metaphor. But metaphors don't require fortified roads, encrypted documents, or silence under torture. The Templars behaved like men who were hiding something real, tangible, traceable, and alive. Occitania gave them space to do so. And not just physically, spiritually. The region's unique blend of Cathar theology and noble patronage allowed for ideas that would be branded heresy elsewhere. The idea of Jesus as a man, a partner, a father. The idea that divine blood did not stop at the cross but continued. That God had a family tree. That heaven had branches. And if the Templars carried that truth westward, it would make sense that they entrusted it not to Rome, but to the hills. To castles without banners. To roads without names. To firelit caves and watchers in plain clothing. Because when you're guarding something that's sacred, the last thing you want is a spotlight. You want shadows, valleys, and silence. You wouldn't expect a crusading order of celibate warrior monks to be tangled up in dynastic marriages. And yet, from the shadows of the Templar commanderies to the halls of Europe's royal courts, a strange pattern emerges. Land grants tied to noble daughters, patronage from houses with legendary ancestry, alliances that seem less political, more genealogical. Because if the Templars were safeguarding a bloodline one traced not through ritual but through lineage, then their connections to Europe's oldest families weren't just convenient. They were essential. It's a historical fact that the Templars were deeply enmeshed with the European nobility. Their founding members came from aristocratic houses, many of them distantly tied to the Merovingians, the semi-mythical first kings of France. The Merovingians, as you may know, were often described as kings by divine right. Some were said to be born of sea creatures, others claimed visions, healing powers, or prophetic dreams, the usual medieval flourishes. But underneath the fantasy, a deeper implication lingered, that their blood was not just royal, but sacred. That idea didn't go unnoticed by the Church, and it certainly didn't die with the dynasty's official end. If anything, it splintered into legend, rumor, and coded family trees, especially in Occitania and Burgundy regions rich with both Templar presence and Merovingian lore. So when the Templars began to acquire land and form relationships with noble families across these regions, it wasn't simply about military logistics. It was about access. Some scholars argue that these alliances allowed the Templars to identify and protect specific bloodlines, branches of families who, whether they knew it or not, may have carried the legacy of Christ. One obscure document buried in a 15th century inheritance dispute refers to those who carry the red sign in the bone. The phrasing is strange, neither coat of arms nor surname, but it appears alongside property once owned by a family with deep ties to Templar benefactors. The red sign might refer to the Templar cross, or it might refer to something passed not by symbol, but by birth. Then there's the case of the de Blanchefort line. Bertrand de Blanchefort was a notable Grand Master of the Templars in the 12th century, and his family holdings surrounded areas later tied to Grail legends. Some researchers believe he reorganized the internal structure of the order to reflect a new mission, not just military command, but stewardship. Guardian roles passed down through blood alliances. Knights married off into key houses, sometimes discreetly, sometimes under other names. But of course there's a problem. Templars were supposed to be celibate. They weren't supposed to marry or father children or involve themselves in dynastic games. Yet there are records, unusual ones, of Templar commanders retiring to rural estates, granted lands in perpetuity, their titles passed quietly to nephews and cousins, who suddenly appear with no prior mention. Some of these families retained influence long after the order's fall, especially in regions where Catharism and Templar ideology overlapped. One such lineage, the Plantard family, claimed descent from both the Merovingians and through them Jesus himself. While modern historians are quick to label the claim a hoax, especially after the controversial Priory of Sion documents emerged in the 20th century, the notion predates those forgeries. It surfaces in 17th century monastic records, in footnotes written with maddening vagueness, where abbots speak of the hidden root from Nazareth now blooming in Gaul. If the Templars believed in this lineage, if they truly thought a bloodline existed, and they could trace it, then aligning themselves with the right families would be more than politics. It would be preservation, and possibly preparation. Because if the bloodline were ever to be revealed, it would need a network not just of warriors, but of heirs. This theory finds support in the strange persistence of certain symbols across family crests and tombs: the rose, the five-pointed star, the ladder, the two fish. None of them uniquely Templar. But taken together, repeated across centuries in stone and stained glass, they begin to whisper. And that whisper sounds like lineage. Scholarly debate splits sharply here. Most reject the idea that the Templars married or sired children in violation of their vows. But records are scarce, and enforcement of those vows varied. Some argue the Templars weren't bloodline custodians at all, but simply fascinated by noble heritage, Others believe the bloodline theory is allegorical, a metaphor for spiritual succession, not biology. But metaphors don't inherit castles. They don't marry into vanished dynasties. They don't leave behind tombstones with unfamiliar names carved in perfect symmetry beside Templar seals. And then there's the final wrinkle. In a 14th century letter seized by the Inquisition, a former Templar writing from an unknown location mentions the twin flame reborn in France watched by brothers who do not speak. The phrase has puzzled researchers for centuries. Who was reborn, what was being watched, and why the need for silence? Unless, of course, silence was the only way to protect something alive. It glimmers in every tale half seen and half promised, a golden chalice hidden in a forest, guarded by riddles and angels. The Holy Grail. A cup, we're told, that caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion, or served him wine at the Last Supper. Knights rode for it. Kings died for it. Entire orders rose and fell under its shadow. But what if the greatest misunderstanding in Christian myth is this, that the Grail was never a vessel at all? What if it was a person? It's a radical idea, one that makes scholars blanch and romantics lean in closer. And for the Templars, it may have been more than a metaphor. If they believed in a sacred bloodline descending from Jesus, if they had seen the documents or known the heirs, then their search for the Grail wasn't for a relic. It was for a lineage, a living one. This interpretation has roots not in fiction, but in the curious phrasing of medieval texts. The earliest Grail stories, especially Le Conte du Graal by Chrétien de Troyes, never describe the Grail as a cup. It's a platter, a mysterious object of light. And Chrétien never finishes the tale. Later authors pick up the threads, Wolfram von Eschenbach, Robert de Boron, and shift the Grail into a vessel. But then things start to mutate. In Wolfram's Parzival, the Grail is described not as a cup at all, but as a stone, one that bestows life and wisdom. No mention of silver, no golden goblet. So where did the cup come from? Some believe the Church promoted the cup version deliberately, a manageable relic, a physical object. But there's another strain of interpretation, one the Templars may have quietly followed. In this version, the Grail is not an item of stone or silver. It is the sang real, the royal blood. The phrase, when run together as sangreal, becomes Holy Grail. When split apart, sang real, royal blood. An obscure hand-copied manuscript discovered in the 18th century in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France contains a variation of the Grail story in which Mary Magdalene is referred to as la coupe vivante, the living cup. She carries not wine, but life, a child, a line. The implication is impossible to ignore. The vessel of Christ's blood was not on a table, it was in a womb. Now step back and look again at Templar architecture. The repeated symbolism of the rose, the chalice, the five-pointed star. The black Madonnas enshrined in obscure corners of Europe, often in Templar churches, depicted with dark skin, ancient eyes, and sometimes with a child not quite the infant Jesus. A different child. Or perhaps the same child seen through a different lens, one not of divinity, but of legacy. It's a fact that Templars revered feminine symbols more than most male military orders of their time. Whether the Virgin Mary, the Magdalene, or more ambiguous figures, they incorporated them into carvings and chapels with strange consistency. Scholars chalk it up to regional devotion or Marian cults. But what if those figures weren't just saints? What if they were symbols of something hidden in plain sight? One particular Templar chapel in Spain, San Bartolomé in the remote canyon of Rio Lobos, is built with a geometry that aligns perfectly with star patterns associated with Isis and Venus. Within it, a carving of a woman and a chalice is tucked into the arch. The woman's face is worn by time, but the cup remains clear. No inscription, no saint's name, just a quiet image of containment, of guardianship. Scholars debate whether this was deliberate, but when the same imagery appears in Languedoc and Tomar and Rosslyn, when it surfaces again and again where the Templars moved and built, you start to wonder if the pattern is the message. If the Grail is a bloodline, not a cup, then the Templars weren't just searching for something, they were protecting someone. Or many someones. Possibly a family line. Possibly scattered. Possibly hidden beneath layers of ritual and oath known only to the inner circle. And that brings us to the real question. If the Grail survived in the form of a lineage, what happened to it after the Templars fell? There are whispers. Of families tucked into minor nobility. Of sudden unexplained inheritances. Of children fostered by monastic orders and then disappearing from record. One 15th century Templar offshoot operating in secrecy in the Auvergne region claimed to serve la descendance silencieuse, the silent descendants. It may have been metaphor, or it may have been a statement of purpose. Modern historians reject this as myth-making, but even they admit the Templars behaved like men guarding something more than gold. Their refusal to divulge information under torture, their coded rituals, their preference for isolation for silence. You don't build a network of fortified safe houses across Europe just to protect a drinking vessel. You do it to protect a bloodline. You do it to protect the Grail. Jerusalem hums with the weight of the ages. Pilgrims tread its cobblestones, searching for holiness. But beneath those stones lie older truths sealed behind centuries of conquest, ritual, and dust. Somewhere under this city, it is said, rests a tomb not marked on any modern map. A burial chamber wrapped not in scripture but in silence. And if the rumors are true, this tomb could change everything. Because the body it holds may not be a saint. It may not even be a martyr. It may be something else entirely, a buried claim to a bloodline the Church would rather forget. First, the facts. Jerusalem is riddled with underground chambers, crypts, cisterns, caves, burial shafts. Some are well known. Others appear briefly in old records and vanish. One such reference appears in a 12th century Byzantine chronicle, which describes a sepulchre sealed in the time of the Apostles, wherein no priest may enter and no prayer is said. It offers no coordinates, but the timing overlaps with early Christian movements and with the rising power of the Templars. This is more than coincidence. The Templars' headquarters stood atop the Temple Mount for nearly 7 decades. While officially based in the Al-Aqsa complex, they had access to a sprawling network of tunnels beneath the city. There is little documentation of what they did down there, but there are plenty of hints. Crusader maps depict a place of rest beneath the Lion Gate marked with a peculiar sigil, 2 fish in a ring. The same symbol found carved into stone in southern France in Templar commanderies and Cathar sanctuaries. The implication, the Templars knew of a tomb beneath Jerusalem, not the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Another one, older, unadorned, and deliberately erased from ecclesiastical memory. A controversial theory, often dismissed by scholars but whispered in esoteric circles, claims that this tomb may contain the remains of Jesus of Nazareth, not the risen Christ of doctrine, but the man, the teacher, the Father. Or perhaps not Jesus himself, but someone close to him, a family member, a wife, a child. If such a tomb were discovered sealed with early Christian symbols protected by layers of architectural misdirection, it would explain why the Templars grew so secretive, why they built replicas of the Holy Sepulchre throughout Europe. Not to honor a legend, to misdirect. One obscure document known as the Carta de Luz, allegedly written by a Templar scribe in the early 1300s, describes a place of keeping where the blood slept. The phrasing is poetic, but the context is not. The letter speaks of a chamber with stone walls and a single sarcophagus. It does not name who lies within, but it refers to the womb returned to the dust and the line sealed in stone until the appointed hour. Was this symbolic or literal? A hidden tomb containing physical evidence of a Christic bloodline would be the ultimate heresy, not because it disproved faith, but because it rewrote its foundation. If Jesus had a family, if he was laid to rest, not in myth, but in stone, then the Church would face an existential crisis. Resurrection would become interpretation, and apostolic succession would become optional. Of course, there's no definitive proof. No one has opened a chamber and found genealogical scrolls beside a wrapped body bearing the Nazarene's likeness, but the clues mount. British explorer James Fergusson, writing in the 1800s, claimed to have found a sealed crypt beneath a Crusader church outside the walls of Jerusalem. He reported no relics, but said the chamber bore no icon, no inscription, only the image of a lily carved at the arch and a stair descending into the silence. The site has since been built over, but the carving the lily repeats in Templar chapels from Portugal to Provence, always unmarked, always slightly off-center, as if guiding the eye to something behind, something buried. Scholarly debate rages over whether the Templars would have even been interested in such a tomb. Traditionalists say no, their mission was military, not mystical, but others point to the order's obsession with resurrection secrecy and descent. The idea that Christ's legacy lived on not in relics, but in blood and bone, in people. If such a tomb exists, it remains sealed, lost to time war and the politics of faith. Or perhaps it isn't lost at all. Perhaps it's simply waiting. You've seen it before, etched into old stones, scrawled in margins, burning in the pages of medieval accusations, a strange figure with a goat's head wings and androgynous form known by a single name, Baphomet. It's the symbol most often hurled at the Templars in the smoldering propaganda that accompanied their downfall. The Church insisted it was proof of devil worship, a heretical idol, a monstrous deity. But what if it wasn't a demon at all? What if it was a cipher one that pointed not to blasphemy, but to a secret the Templars had no language to safely reveal? The historical fact is this: during the trials of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century, multiple members confessed under torture to worshipping or acknowledging something called Baphomet. The descriptions varied wildly. Some said it was a head. Others described a bearded face with glowing eyes. A few claimed it could speak. The ambiguity was taken as confirmation of guilt, heresy, apostasy, witchcraft, but no object fitting those descriptions was ever found. Centuries later, occultists would reinvent the image. Eliphas Levi in the 19th century created the now iconic goat-headed figure complete with inverted pentagram torch and wings. A modern invention, yes, but one rooted in the mystery that clung to the word Baphomet like fog. Levi interpreted it not as a devil, but as a symbol of unity of opposites reconciled. Male and female, light and dark, divine and mortal, which curiously aligns with a different theory altogether. Some scholars believe Baphomet is a corruption of Muhammad, the medieval European name for Muhammad, suggesting the Templars had adopted Islamic practices during their time in the East. Others propose a Greek derivation Baphe Metus, meaning baptism of wisdom. But among those who study the bloodline hypothesis, a more provocative idea emerges that Baphomet wasn't an idol at all. It was a code name, a symbol, a stand-in for a person, or a line. In this theory, the head the Templars were accused of worshipping was not a grotesque statue, but a reliquary possibly containing a skull or a likeness, or even genealogical documents sealed in metal. One confiscated Templar inventory from Poitiers lists Caput Magnum Great Head among its relics, but gives no further detail. Some interpret this as a reference to John the Baptist. Others believe it was something more forbidden, a symbol of lineage. One obscure Templar rite hinted at in Inquisition transcripts involves the phrase il sangue nascosto, the hidden blood. It appears in testimony from Aragon spoken by a knight who claimed to have seen a veiled form in the center of a Templar ceremony. A woman, he said, but not living, a representation. Some researchers argue that Baphomet, originally invoked in fractured confession, was a code word for this idea of preserved blood, preserved legacy, the seal of a lineage. If the Templars had knowledge of a sacred bloodline descending from Jesus, if they held documents, artifacts, or even relics tied to this truth, then they would need a system of symbols to encode it. One that wouldn't attract attention. One that could be hidden in plain sight. Look closer at the later image of Baphomet and strange echoes appear. The torch between the horns, illumination. The arms pointing up and down as above, so below. The wings, flight or escape. The breasts, fertility, birth. The caduceus twin serpents coiled around the spine, the sacred path of energy, or dual lines. The balance of masculine and feminine. All of this reads less like a satanic idol and more like an esoteric diagram. A guardian of something powerful. Perhaps not power itself, but inheritance. One document kept in private hands and only partially revealed supposedly contains a ciphered list of symbols found in Templar churches throughout southern France. Among them the fish, the rose, the hexagram, and a simplified version of Levi's Baphomet, only instead of a goat's head, the image bears a stylized face. Feminine, eyes closed. This isn't devil worship. This is concealment. The scholarly debate around Baphomet is vicious. Some insist it was always a product of church slander. Others suggest the Templars adopted elements of Gnostic or Islamic mysticism and repackaged them. But the theory gaining quiet momentum is this, that Baphomet was a name, a label for the thing too dangerous to name outright. Not a demon, not a god. A symbol of forbidden knowledge, of a bloodline, of a woman who carried it, of descendants who still might. And perhaps that's why the symbol has endured, because symbols can be destroyed, but not decoded, not fully, not by those without the key. And the Templars, it seems, buried that key deep. It wasn't a clean fall. The dissolution of the Knights Templar was not a sudden thunderclap, but a slow collapse, a campaign of shadows, manipulation, and fire. But what stands out most is not just how the Templars were destroyed, it's why. The usual reasons, greed, fear, papal politics, are convenient. But when you peel back the layers of this medieval takedown, another possibility takes shape. The order wasn't silenced because it had power. It was silenced because it had knowledge. Knowledge that no throne and certainly no altar could afford to let breathe. The historical record begins clearly enough. On Friday, October 13, 1307, yes, that Friday the 13th, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of every Templar in his realm. The charges were sensational, blasphemy, idol worship, heresy, sodomy, spitting on the cross. All sourced from confessions extracted under torture. Pope Clement V, initially hesitant, was soon pressured into compliance. Trials followed. So did inquisitions. And in the end, The once mighty Templar order was dismantled brick by brick. But something doesn't add up. The Templars had been powerful for nearly 2 centuries. Kings owed them money. Popes sought their blessing. They controlled lands from Scotland to Cyprus and operated an early form of banking that made them both wealthy and discreet. Yet they were taken down with remarkable speed. Not in battle, but with documents, ink, and fear. So what was King Philip really after? It's well established that Philip owed the Templars a great deal of money. His treasury was bleeding. He had already taxed the clergy and debased the currency. But erasing a debt doesn't require wiping out an entire order. It requires a ledger, a pardon, maybe a battlefield. Not coordinated arrests at dawn, confessions written in blood, and public burnings designed to sear a message into the soul of Europe. No, this was more than financial. One theory suggests that Philip was tipped off that someone within the church or close to the Templars revealed the deeper purpose of the order. That beneath the surface of chivalry and crusade, they held something: documents, relics, bloodlines that could destabilize the very institution that blessed kings and crowned emperors. There's an obscure papal memorandum, the Chinon parchment rediscovered in the Vatican secret archives in 2001. It confirms that Pope Clement V absolved the Templars of heresy in private, even as the trials continued in public. The parchment is real. It's not fringe speculation, and its implications are damning. If the Pope knew the charges were false, why proceed, unless something else had to be erased? The silencing of the Templars wasn't about punishing a crime. It was about preventing a revelation. Inquisition records contain curious omissions. Entire trial transcripts vanish. Names are redacted. Property inventories so meticulous elsewhere list unspecified manuscripts or sealed reliquaries. No description. No contents, just gone. Witnesses describe Templar rituals as secretive, symbolic, unnerving. Initiates swore never to reveal the names of those who carry the line. The line. That word surfaces again and again in confession. Not doctrine, not treasure. Line. Some spoke of a head they venerated not in worship but in reverence. Others mentioned a kiss on the base of the spine, which scholars have interpreted as ritual humiliation. But in symbolic terms, it could be something else. The base of the spine, the root, is the source of life lineage energy. What if the act was not humiliation, but acknowledgement? The church accused them of idolatry, but never could produce the idol. It accused them of sorcery, but found no spells. It accused them of sin, but failed to explain why men who had spent decades fighting for Christ would suddenly abandon him for a goat. Unless the crime wasn't betrayal, it was possession. If the Templars held proof of a sacred bloodline, if they knew that Christ had not only lived and died, but lived again through descendants, then their very existence threatened the legitimacy of Rome. Apostolic succession would be exposed as political theater. The Pope's claim to divine authority would crumble beneath the weight of blood. So the order had to be dismantled, not defeated, but deleted. And the men who knew too much burned, silenced, or disappeared. Because not all were captured. Some vanished into the countryside. Some were protected by sympathetic nobles' families who may have been tied to the same bloodline. And in the years that followed, whispers of surviving Templar networks, secret rites and veiled guardians began to ripple through the Alps, the Languedoc, the Highlands. Scholars still argue over what really happened. Some insist the Templars simply outlived their usefulness. Others see a political purge. But a few quietly, carefully ask the deeper question. Not what they did, but what they were keeping. The flames rose slowly that morning on the Ile de la Cité, licking the cold March air with grim resolve. A crowd had gathered priests, soldiers, merchants pulled by the morbid magnetism of finality. And there bound to a stake stood Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. His beard singed, his robes torn, but his voice unshaken. What he said in those final moments has echoed through history, not just for its defiance, but for what may have been buried within it, a warning, a vow, and perhaps a secret. It is a fact that de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314 under the order of King Philip IV. He had confessed under torture, recanted later, and refused to betray his brethren or his oath. As the flames reached his feet, he reportedly cursed both the king and the pope, summoning them to stand before God within a year. And both men, strangely enough, were dead within that time. Legend, possibly. But the fire was real. What matters more is what else he said. According to multiple eyewitnesses, including chroniclers in Italy and France, de Molay proclaimed that the order was innocent and that its true mission had not ended. In some accounts, he declared, "The truth is not extinguished. It walks still." Other versions phrase it differently. The line continues. These words have been interpreted in dozens of ways: spiritual perseverance, organizational pride, eschatological prophecy. But in the context of the Templar bloodline theory, they take on a more literal tone. The line continues. Not just the idea, the blood. Here's the obscure detail. One lesser-known account from the Venetian archives claims that as de Molay burned, he turned toward the east and whispered something in a tongue not understood by the surrounding priests. One scribe wrote that it resembled Hebrew or Aramaic. Another speculated it was a prayer, but others, particularly among the esoteric orders of the 16th and 17th centuries, believed it was a name, a family name. If de Molay had knowledge of the bloodline, if the upper echelons of the Templars were sworn to protect the descendants of Christ, then his execution wasn't just martyrdom. It was the attempted erasure of a witness. But erasure never works perfectly. Before his arrest, de Molay had time to warn, to dispatch letters, to secure relics. Some believe he entrusted a final cache of documents to a Templar emissary who fled north into Scotland, where sympathizers waited. Others argue he encoded a message into a ritual still used by certain Masonic rites. Today, a passage about the blood of the lion that flows unseen, guarded by flame. That phrase is peculiar, and it appears curiously in a Masonic catechism dated to the early 18th century. What is the Grail, it asks. The answer given: that which carries the light of the blood. Not wine, not a cup, the light of the blood. A person, a line. The deeper you go, the more you see de Molay, not as a defeated man, but as a sentinel. Someone who knew that the order's outer walls were crumbling, but the inner sanctum, the truth at its heart, had already been carried away. That in the silence of his death, something else would survive. Modern historians tend to sidestep these interpretations. The prevailing view is that the Templars were victims of political greed, their supposed heresies fabricated to justify their destruction. But even skeptics admit de Molay's stoicism, his refusal to betray any details under torture, and his final words don't quite fit the script. He wasn't just protecting his fellow knights. He was guarding something deeper. One last curious fact. In the ruins of a Templar chapel near Gisors, discovered during renovations in the 1960s, a series of stone reliefs were uncovered, long covered by plaster. Among them, a man in chains, facing east, with a star above his head and a flowering branch beneath his feet. No inscription, no known biblical reference, just an image, a message. To those who believe the bloodline survived, this is no ordinary symbol. The star marks destiny. The chains signify silence, and the branch is legacy. It's possible that Jacques de Molay died with nothing on his lips but defiance. It's also possible he died with a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud. And maybe he didn't need to say it, because the truth was already walking away. When the last Templar bastions fell in the east, what mattered most didn't stay behind. Jerusalem was lost, yes. Acre had fallen. But if the Knights Templar had truly uncovered and protected a bloodline, a lineage that traced back to Jesus himself, it would not have been left in the sands of the Levant. It would have traveled, hidden, disguised, preserved not by empires, but by silence, devotion, and design. And so the story continues, not on the battlefield, but in the margins of European history, where ordinary names mask extraordinary ancestry. One widely accepted fact: after the suppression of the order in 1312, many Templars disappeared. Some were imprisoned, others executed. But a significant number, especially those far from France, simply vanished. In Portugal, the order was renamed and restructured under King Dinas, becoming the Order of Christ. In Scotland, they were sheltered by Robert the Bruce, excommunicated himself at the time. In Switzerland, they helped form what would become the foundation of an independent, disciplined militia culture. But these were not just strategic retreats. They were relocations, and perhaps they were guardianship assignments. Certain names begin to surface: repeatedly obscure noble houses in remote regions, suddenly acquiring wealth, land, or favor without explanation. Families in the Languedoc, the Pyrenees, the Highlands. Genealogies that trace back to unknown Eastern wives' brothers who returned from the wars, or unnamed Templar benefactors. The language is always vague, but the timing is precise. These families rise just as the order falls, and some of them endure. One such family is the St. Clairs of Rosslyn, whose chapel in Scotland has long been linked to Templar and Masonic legends. The chapel, built in the 15th century, is covered in stone carvings that seem to defy traditional Christian iconography. Angels with cornstalks, plants unknown in Europe at the time. Twin pillars echoing the Temple of Solomon. And at its heart, a pattern of stars and roses that many believe encodes a message, the continuation of something sacred. Possibly, someone. Another curious thread winds through the noble houses of Aragon and Navarre, where multiple branches claim descent from those who came west with the fire. That phrase appears in a 14th century Spanish ledger detailing property transfers to newly ennobled families. One entry specifically refers to a dowry of the flame, a poetic, perhaps coded phrase. And it appears again 3 generations later in a private baptismal record where a child is named Leona del Fuego, Lioness of the Fire. Coincidence, possibly. But layered symbolism tends not to arise by accident. Many scholars argue that all of this is folklore, romantic embroidery over mundane records, but even they struggle to explain the consistency of symbols. The persistence of particular names: Sarah, Isaac, Magdalene, Nazar, David, names that carry weight in both biblical and Templar tradition. And when these names reappear across unrelated families in regions touched by the order, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. There is, too, the question of protection. If the bloodline continued, it would need cover. Not just through secrecy, but through strategic placement. Intermarriage. Dispersal. Certain families may have been tasked with more than raising children. They may have been assigned the role of custodians, not of gold, but of genealogy. A fragmentary manuscript discovered in a Portuguese monastery describes a council convened in 1321, years after the order's dissolution, where 9 men, none named, vowed to shelter the light of the living branch. The document ends abruptly, but the phrasing aligns closely with earlier Templar code referring to the line, the flame, and the keeper of the vessel. Different metaphors. One idea. This raises a profound and difficult question. If a bloodline did survive, where is it now? Some argue it went extinct, vanishing quietly into anonymity. Others claim it persists hidden within ordinary families unaware of their heritage. A few go further, suggesting that certain secret societies, not just Masonic orders, but older, deeper ones, exist solely to preserve and protect this legacy. They do not seek power. They seek preservation. And yet, there are those who believe the bloodline has already re-emerged. In the 20th century, a number of controversial genealogical studies surfaced, claiming to trace certain European dynasties, notably the Merovingians, back to figures described in apocryphal Gospels. Most of these were dismissed, debunked, or quietly buried. But among them were documents that included Templar seals, watermarks, inscriptions matching those found in Rosslyn, Montségur, and Gisors. Are these forgeries or fragments of something older we may never know? Because if the bloodline continues, its greatest strength is its invisibility. Its ability to survive not through dominance but through disappearance. And perhaps that was the Templars' final act. Not to declare the lineage, not to enshrine it in marble or crown it in gold, but to scatter it, guard it, and wait. Because some legacies are not meant to rule. They're meant to endure. You don't need shining armor or war horses to be a guardian. In fact, if your mission is to protect something unspeakable, something ancient and destabilizing, then quiet is better. Quiet and invisible. And as the centuries passed, long after the last Templar banners were lowered, whispers persisted. That the guardians never stopped. They simply changed robes, changed names, and slipped into the folds of new organizations. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, priories, orders with no faces, only rituals, and among them a small few may still hold the torch once passed in blood and fire. Not to rule, not to reveal, but to keep. One thing is certain, the legacy of the Knights Templar didn't die with Jacques de Molay. It transformed. Historically, elements of the order were absorbed into the Portuguese Ordem de Cristo, which later funded exploration voyages, including those of Henry the Navigator. In Scotland, Templar fugitives allegedly found refuge with sympathetic clans, their influence preserved in stonework tomb carvings and quietly continued rites. These aren't legends born of fantasy, they're recorded transitions, shifts in structure, legal rebrandings wrapped around a deeper truth. But beyond the visible institutions, more elusive names surface. The Priory of Sion, the Brotherhood of the Rose Cross, the Order of the Hidden Light. Most of these are dismissed by mainstream historians as inventions or later mythologies. And yet in private archives, symbols persist, recurring, evolving, adapting across centuries. The same 8-pointed star, the twin fish, the rose, and beneath them all silence. In the 18th century, the Masonic movement exploded across Europe, and the Americas offering a new container for old ideas. While Freemasonry has no proven genealogical link to the Templars, its higher degrees borrow heavily from Templar legend. The Knight Templar degree remains a major part of Masonic York Rite tradition. And within its esoteric circles, talk of the Grail, the Bloodline, and the Magdalene never truly disappears. It lingers in symbols, in oaths, in certain invocations whispered at candlelit altars. One obscure Masonic ritual from 1792 recovered from a German lodge and preserved in private holdings refers to the living temple made not of stone but of flesh. It declares that those who bear the mark of the vine shall neither rule nor kneel but watch. The phrase mark of the vine is ambiguous, but when placed alongside earlier Templar phrasing around the branch, the flame and the blood, the symbolic pattern becomes harder to dismiss. And then there are the custodian families. Certain modern noble lineages, particularly in southern France and northern Spain, have long maintained unusually detailed family records, some extending unbroken for over 900 years. A few of these families have been linked to former Templar strongholds, with genealogical charts showing discrete connections to Templar patrons, Cathar protectors, and key Merovingian figures. They rarely speak publicly, but on rare occasions, usually at funerals or closed-door initiations, symbols re-emerge. Seals, carvings, phrases not found in any Bible. What are they preserving? Not power, clearly. None of these groups hold military sway or political clout. Their gatherings are small, their presence subtle. But their consistency across centuries, languages, borders suggests more than tradition. It suggests purpose. And that purpose may still echo the original Templar vow to protect what cannot be spoken. To guard not just a secret, but a story. One born in Galilee, hidden beneath Jerusalem, scattered across Occitania, and quietly nurtured to this day. Contemporary scholars remain divided. Some argue that modern secret societies are elaborate role-playing groups driven by nostalgia and myth, not ancient truth. Others insist that even if no literal bloodline exists, these orders preserve a different kind of inheritance, a mystical memory of the divine in the human. A lineage of knowledge, if not DNA. But then there are the outliers. Researchers who dig into Vatican vault references, coded archives, forgotten notaries. Some believe key documents, true genealogical scrolls, may still exist. Not digitized, not published, but handwritten, hidden, guarded. In 2004, a leaked letter from a European antiquarian dealer claimed the existence of a covenant scroll allegedly passed through 6 families since the 14th century. It allegedly details the descent of the light through the Magdalene vessel safeguarded by the Nine. The letter has never been authenticated. No copy of the scroll has surfaced, but the wording fits perfectly within the symbolic code used by both Templar and later esoteric groups. So perhaps the question isn't whether modern orders are protecting something, it's what they believe they're protecting. If it's truth, it's a truth that could shift the world's axis. If it's myth, then it's the most meticulously protected myth in history, one guarded not with swords, but with silence. And if it's blood, then perhaps even now, somewhere in a chapel, a cellar, or a candlelit lodge, a name is being spoken, not to declare it, but to remember. Beneath the gleaming colonnades and polished marble floors of Vatican City lies a world most pilgrims will never see. Not a chapel, not a crypt, but a vault. Long corridors of silence, sealed rooms without windows keys that only change hands once a generation. This isn't fiction, it's real. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Secret Archive, stretches over 85 kilometers of shelving. Not metaphorically, literally. And inside those shelves rest the shadows of history letters, decrees, confessions, and curiosities. But it's what's not on the catalog that keeps certain researchers awake at night. Because some documents, it seems, were never meant to be read at all. Officially, the archive holds over 35,000 volumes dating back over 12 centuries. There are receipts from Michelangelo's payment for painting the Sistine Chapel, correspondence between popes and monarchs, the bull excommunicating Martin Luther. These aren't rumors, they're real and verifiable. The Vatican has even begun a slow process of digitization, revealing slivers of its treasure to the world. But that's only the light. And then there is the dark. Among the unindexed files, researchers whisper about suppressed Gospels, trial records of heretical bishops, and files labeled simply with ancient initials. Access is limited severely. Scholars must apply specifying the exact document they want, and even then requests are often denied without explanation. No wandering, no browsing, no photography. Just one ancient folio handed across a table by gloved archivists, and you are watched as you read. One controversial document repeatedly requested and repeatedly denied relates to the so-called Gospel of the Blood. It appears on no published index, but in the margin notes of an 1895 Jesuit inventory, its Latin title is handwritten Evangelium Sanguinis. The Jesuit scribes wrote a single line of description testimony attributed to Maria of Magdala concerning the offspring of the Nazarene. Whether it exists physically or ever did is unknown. But the scribes, meticulous and serious, wrote it down with trembling care. The note ends with a word underlined twice prohibitus. A more public mystery surrounds the Chinon parchment long thought lost, but rediscovered in 2001 by historian Barbara Frail. The document revealed that Pope Clement V had absolved the Templars of heresy. Not just some of them, all of them. Quietly, secretly. The parchment had been misfiled or hidden for over 700 years. If such a consequential record could lie hidden for centuries, what else might be waiting in the silent shelves? A 1623 letter from a Benedictine monk archived in the Library of Avignon recounts an attempted exchange between the Vatican and a French noble house. The letter refers to a set of sealed scrolls relating to the heirs of the Lamb presently in private custody, offered in exchange for canonization of Saint Emmerin. The Vatican declined. The scrolls vanished. The monk was reassigned to a cloister in Sicily. No further mention of the incident was ever found in public records. Of course, defenders of the archive argue for confidentiality, not conspiracy. The Church, they say, has a duty to protect not only doctrine but dignity of saints, martyrs, monarchs, and millions of ordinary believers. Some things, they insist, must remain hidden, not to deceive but to prevent misunderstanding. Yet even that raises the question, if the truth is too dangerous to reveal, then what is the truth? Modern speculation runs wild. Some believe there is a Vatican dossier on the Holy Grail, not as a cup, but as a genealogical record. Others whisper of a vault within the vault, accessible only by the Pope and a select few curators. And the architecture itself seems to collaborate with secrecy underground chambers, without elevators, stone walls 8 feet thick. Even rumors of a sealed staircase that hasn't been opened since the 1800s. A 1998 exposé in an Italian journal claimed to have spoken to a former archivist who described a locked drawer within the private papal archive, marked simply with the letter M. Its contents, he alleged, included handwritten notes referencing the Southern Line, the Girl from Galilee, and the letter of transmission. The Vatican denied the story outright. The journalist vanished from the public eye 3 years later. Heart attack, they said. But the questions don't fade. Because despite technological progress, despite scanners and satellite maps and glass-walled museums, the greatest secrets of the Church remain under lock and key, sometimes even from its own clergy. Documents like the Evangelium Sanguinis remain phantom entries in forbidden indexes. Testimonies like the Benedictines survive only in secondary correspondence. And when scholars look for patterns, they find too many across time, languages, continents. No single document confirms the theory. But the absences, the missing years, the missing scrolls, the missing names seem to confirm something else. That silence itself may be the loudest proof of all. Now the map lies open before you. Not a parchment one scrawled in ink and blood, but the invisible map formed in your mind, drawn across the folds of 2,000 years. You followed the winding trail from the dusty stones of Jerusalem to the cold vaults of the Vatican. You've walked in the silence of the Essenes and listened to the last words of a Grand Master. And now you pause at the edge of something harder to name than evidence. Not a fact, not quite a belief, something in between. A hypothesis shaped by the weight of omission and the persistent hum of too many coincidences. Let's gather it all slowly. The Templars, 9 in number at their founding, received not only unprecedented power, but also immediate access to the holiest and most politically sensitive site in Christendom, the Temple Mount. There, beneath the stones, they dug, for years, not in defense of pilgrims, but in pursuit of something buried. When they emerged, they were transformed. Wealth followed. So did secrets. And then there was the silence about what they found. Soon whispers began, of scrolls unearthed, of relics guarded not in glass cases but behind blood oaths, of knowledge that could unsettle the very spine of Christian doctrine. They carved symbols into the walls of their commanderies, abstract to some, but to others, especially to those familiar with Jewish mysticism, Gnostic fragments and suppressed gospels, those shapes whispered of lineage, of succession of names, passed down like torches hidden in caves. Jesus the Nazarene is almost universally accepted by historians to have lived. That much is agreed. But the details of his life, his relationships, his movements between youth and ministry, his silence in Rome's official records remain murky. In that murk, legends thrive. Mary Magdalene, once dismissed as a prostitute, is reevaluated as the apostle to the apostles. Not a follower, an equal, perhaps more. Her presence at the tomb, her whispered message to the others, it all suggests an intimacy the early church later found inconvenient. The Gnostic texts hint almost playfully at hidden teachings passed to her alone. The Gospel of Philip refers to her as Jesus' companion and speaks of a kiss not metaphorical but tangible, not a symbol of doctrine but of lineage. Then the scrolls vanish, declared apocryphal, some burned, others buried. But what if one survived? What if, as the fragments from Qumran and Nag Hammadi suggest, early communities believed in a sacred bloodline? Not divine in the supernatural sense, but holy because it preserved the essence of Jesus through flesh and family. What if the Templars found not just relics beneath Solomon's temple, but records, a genealogical trail, perhaps encoded in symbols, perhaps guarded in metaphor? A child born not in Bethlehem, but in the years after Golgotha. This would explain much. Why the Templars became so fiercely independent from papal control. Why their downfall came so swiftly when accusations of heresy were made. Why in their moments of torture and death they refused to deny some unnamed truth. Consider also the marriages between Templar knights and noble women across Europe. These weren't merely strategic alliances. In some cases, they followed the trail of descendants known only to a small inner circle. Marriages in Occitania, southern France, and the region surrounding Montségur, long rumored to be a safe haven for the Grail, or rather the Sang Real. The royal blood. That's the crux of it. The Holy Grail as a chalice, pretty imagery endlessly replicated in art and cinema. But the older interpretations, those whispered among heretics and mystics, speak not of an object, but of a womb, a vessel of life, the bearer of a holy bloodline. When the Church rebranded the Grail, turning it into an object to be sought, rather than a person to be protected, they redirected the gaze of generations. Away from lineage, away from flesh, and toward abstraction. The Templars, it seems, never quite accepted that bait and switch, and they paid the price. Now we return to the Vatican vaults, to the documents that may confirm all of this but are sealed, to the ancient letters referencing the heirs of the Lamb, to the gospel that might speak in Magdalene's own voice, to the scrolls that were offered in exchange for silence, and to the whispered codes in the Templars' own seal. A bearded head, they called it Baphomet. But maybe it was just a mask one designed to distract, to invite accusation, to protect something else entirely. In this theory, the Templars become not merely warriors, not bankers, not builders, but guardians, custodians of a secret so volatile, so identity-altering, that it had to be protected behind layers of myth, architecture, ritual, and misdirection. A child, a family, a line of descent, not superhuman, but deeply human. One that lived in shadow, hid in plain sight, and perhaps, just perhaps, still does. And yet, as with all grand mysteries, the question remains not whether it's true, but whether the possibility of it is more powerful than certainty. Because if the bloodline exists, it forces a reckoning not only with history, but with belief, with the way institutions wield power, with the nature of divinity itself, and with the simple, terrifying idea that truth might have a body, a name, and a face. If your eyes are still open, then perhaps it's because the mind is still turning. The pieces don't settle easily. They never do when the story ends with more questions than answers. But as we let the last of the candles burn low, you're not asked to believe, only to wonder. Imagine just for a moment that everything fits. That beneath the banners and armor, beneath the sand-worn boots of those Templar knights, lay a burden not of war, but of protection. Not of treasure, but of testimony. That their sword was drawn not for conquest, but to guard the fragile thread of a bloodline stitched into the folds of history. And what if it survived through mountain passes and crumbling castles, through whispered names and forgotten scrolls, through daughters raised in silence, sons married into minor houses, a legacy not of miracles but of memory? Would it change the world? Perhaps not. But it might change yours. Because in a way, the idea is what we've been protecting all along. The belief that truth matters. That secrets are not erased just because they're hidden. That faith, real faith, isn't a fortress, but a door. One we choose to open. Tonight, we've stood in front of that door. We've listened for echoes in ancient stones. We've followed a trail lit not by certainty, but by the flicker of forgotten stories. And we've allowed ourselves just for a moment to imagine what history might look like, if it had blood and breath. So breathe with it now. Let it exhale in the quiet. The vaults are locked. The symbols remain. The names fade. But the question, that delicate, dangerous, beautiful question, still lingers. And perhaps that's enough. Good night.